Welcome to the Andreas Orthey podcast series on robotics. My guest in this episode is Bradley Nelson. Bradley is a professor of robotics and intelligent systems at ETH Zürich and one of the pioneers of Microrobotics. In this episode, we will talk about the challenges in making robots at very small scales, how we can make robots even smaller, and what the physical limits are, and how microrobots can be used in treatments for diseases like strokes. I'm grateful that he was able to join me. Please welcome Bradley Nelson.
So thank you so much, Brad, for coming here. You run a very successful robotics lab where you really go onto the smallest scale of robotics. And can you maybe talk a little bit about your goals and which research questions you're pursuing in your lab?
So we started thinking about, I started thinking about doing robotics at small scales back in the early 90s, around 92, 93. I was working on arms, robot arms, doing visual servoing, force control, traditional assembly type robots for factories. And at the time, it seemed like a lot of the problems had been solved. So we started thinking, well, what's new and interesting? And so at that time, if you go back to that time, it was kind of the golden age of MEMS, micro electromechanical systems. There had been big successes in accelerometers for vehicles for blowing airbags and pressure sensors, digital mirror displays, all sorts of things were starting to come out that were quite interesting. And I wonder what robotics problems there are. And so we started just thinking about all the things that have been going on in robotics for the 40 years or so before that with arms, and what was unique about the microscale. And there was a couple things. One is you realize the optics are different. You've got to use different, microscopes and things like that rather than regular cameras. And the other thing was the physics of part interactions. So at large scales, I thought about friction and mass, but at small scales, like in 95, two papers came out, one from Ron Fearing at Berkeley and the other from Yoshi Fukuda and Fumihiro Arai at Nagoya, and they both explored the physics of particle interactions at small scales. And I realized, there's actually some interesting questions here. How do you handle small things? How do you manipulate them? And then that kind of drove us along a number of different paths in developing technologies. And then when I moved to Zurich in 2002 and in 2003 was thinking about, grand challenges in the field. And I realized actually, that it's interesting to assemble things and manipulate them and some of the robotics problems. But what people really seemed more interested in were the devices, the things we were making. So I thought, can we make small, intelligent machines? And if we do, what would they do? And how would we make them and that? And so, first, it was just basic questions. How do you make things move at small scales? What are we going to do? What are they going to do? What's the motivation for it? And that just has taken off. And eventually, where I've moved into, you realize a lot of these applications are going to probably be in medicine, delivering drugs, these kinds of things. And so that kind of moved me into this field of medical robotics, which I first heard of in 1990. I thought it was a crazy idea, but then, for the last 15 years or so, I've been working relatively intensely in the field of medical robotics. And so healthcare applications in that are, I think, the kinds of things we're exploring and trying to figure out not just how do you make these things, but how do you actually get them through a regulatory process to get them in humans. So that's a huge, huge challenge.
I imagine that this is really one of the key problems there. Really have also regulatory guidelines following them.
Yeah, it makes you think how you do design differently, how you design things. You have to think about issues like sterility, things you normally we don't think about at large scales. We think about what are the risks in ways that we think about risk whenever you build something, but you have to think of it completely differently when you're thinking about medical devices. You also, realize it takes a tremendous investment to get these things out of the lab and into the clinic. And so you also need to think a little bit about your business models even. Does it make sense to go into an area? There's always the intellectual interest, and that's good enough, to an extent, but then you also have to think, what kinds of problems are you going to solve, and does it really make sense to put your effort and all, into that? You can't do everything, and you gotta pick and choose.
And so let me just go back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What actually motivated you in the beginning to go into robotics, or what was your path towards coming to the also micro robots, medical robotics?
So I didn't really think about robotics much. I swear I became an engineer because of the space program. I think I was 7 years old when they landed on the moon, right? And I didn't want to be an astronaut, but I was just fascinated by the rockets and the engineering and the lunar module and the land, and all that. I still am fascinated by that. Made me want to, I always enjoyed as a kid, just, building stuff. And then when I did my bachelor's degree, I found myself really attracted to control theory. There was a beauty to the math, the way you looked at these systems. I like making things that move, just that thrill of building a machine and watching it move and understanding it. But in 1984, I moved to Minnesota to do a master's degree and wanted to do control theory. And the closest I could get was robotics. I had seen people when I was a bachelor student doing robotics, and I thought it's a little messy. They're just building stuff, and it didn't seem that interesting. But when I got to Minnesota, it was the closest I could get to controls was robotics. And then as I explored it, I realized, oh wow, there's actually some pretty deep problems here. Really hard problems. Problems.
What were the first systems which control it, for which you wrote controllers?
Well, so back then, manipulators people used were the Puma 560, a 6 degree of freedom articulated arm, and then Adept Technologies came out with a 4 degree of freedom SCARA, selective compliance. What does SCARA stand for? I can't recall now even, but it
was all on fixed.
But it was fixed manipulators and just learning how to program them, programming assembly Workcells, putting force control. Force control was a new topic, and I was fortunate to work with one of the very first force control systems that could really do high bandwidth, and I mean 100 hertz kind of things. And that was mid to late 80s. I was working 85 to 80, 84 to 87 in that. So that was a very exciting time in robotics. If you go back then, people started using the term AI a lot then, but when they meant AI, they were talking about knowledge-based reasoning, rule-based systems. Lisp, people program in Lisp a lot and these things. And I think turned out these were very brittle systems, not a very, and by the end of the 80s, people had kind of woken up to the fact that this robotics problem is a lot harder than we thought. And we really didn't make much headway on the AI problem then. But I never lost my thrill of building machines, programming robots, watching them assemble complicated objects. And so I think, I started with industrial level robot arms, programming them, trying to add more sensors. Even vision systems back then weren't very interesting. And I started first working in computer vision in 1985 as an intern at Honeywell, doing computer vision research for a DARPA project, a military project. But and that was a blast. Computer vision was very fun back then. So,
and can you maybe trace back this moment where you actually thought about applying robotics also on a smaller scale, possible?
Yeah, that would have been, I was doing a PhD. I did a PhD from 90 to 95 at Carnegie Mellon in the robotics PhD program. And I got about halfway through my PhD, 92, 93, and I was working with visual servoing and force control. And I realized at that time, robotics was not very popular, to be honest. It wasn't like it is now. And I realized that there weren't a lot of research problems in arms. People were looking at mobile robots. They were looking, like I said, this was the age where MEMS was taking off, microsystems. We hadn't gotten to nanotechnology yet. That hadn't become a buzzword. And so I started thinking, well, the trends are towards MEMS, factory floor robot times arms were not a research topic. And so it occurred to me, what if I just did all of this big robot stuff under microscopes and high precision positioners? And
so what did you think about in terms of like applications in the first place? So what made you like really interested and say, okay, this is something where the future will go to?
Yeah, I think the first, I didn't think a lot about applications. I just thought about things I didn't understand and trying to figure them out, like the physics of how parts interact at these scales. I'd never really, I'd had courses, but hadn't thought much about things like van der Waals forces or electrostatic attractions, surface tension, even, with a little water, just with humidity, you get all these interaction forces, and just trying to understand that became interesting. I was really driven by, I think, just intellectual curiosity. But I'm an engineer, and at some point, I want to make sure what I do is useful, right? and so then you think, oh, what can we do with this? Well, everybody when MEMS was doing, it was all photolithography and deposition, etching. It was all this kind of addition, subtraction, photolithography process. And I thought, well, you could make more complicated things if you could figure out ways to assemble things at small scales. That was probably a little naive of me to think that, but I didn't know any better, and it was something worth exploring, I think. So initially you're driven by curiosity, and then I think you start to see some of these problems, and then you start thinking, okay, now what are some of the applications we're going to find for this? Which is the story of robotics, right? We've got a lot of hammers looking for nails to hit, right, in the field, and so we've got a lot of technologies, but we're trying to figure out where they fit, and that's sometimes people say it should be the other way around, right? That you want to find the problem and then try to solve it. But I mean, I think in research, it goes both ways. So
a lot of your applications are, of course, in medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So what made you actually become interested in this topic?
So I think it was probably 1990, 91. I was a first-year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, and we would have Friday afternoons a robotics seminar. They bring in speakers from all over, and you'd have read their papers, and then you get to meet them and listen to them talk. It was really, really, I think, a great thing for a student to see. And this guy came in from IBM, and he'd been a researcher and had been using some of their industrial arms to do hip implants on dogs, to try to drill into dogs' thighs for that, and talked about robot surgery of the future. This guy was a guy by the name of Russ Taylor, who's now at Johns Hopkins, been there for decades at Johns Hopkins, and is kind of the father of medical robotics. But at the time, he was just doing kind of these crazy ideas. He had these long visions of using robots to operate on people, which at the time just seemed crazy to me. But it's something that struck me as, that's interesting. I wonder where that's going to go. So I always kind of followed the field, never really moved into it. But then as I started working with trying to make microrobots, when in really about 2003 was when I started thinking about making microrobots, one of the applications was going to be, can these things move through your body and deliver drugs, for instance, to your retina to cure retinal disease, or in your brain to unblock brain tumors. And so that pulled me back into that field of medical robotics. And if you go back at 2003, if you look at that time frame, Intuitive Surgical had come into clinics just around that time frame with their Da Vinci robot. It was not very successful at the beginning. They were trying to do single bypass heart surgery, but wasn't making an impact. But then they found prostate surgery, and all of a sudden started taking off. And the other thing that came to the market then was the given imaging camera pill. So a little pill that's about 11 millimeters in diameter and about 29 millimeters long, and it has a camera, light, wireless transfer, and you would swallow it, and it would take pictures of your gastrointestinal tract, and that was coming out. And so I looked at those things in 2003, and I was like, here's where maybe if we think 20 years in the future, here's where microrobots might be. They might look at going, smaller, moving through the body and deeper into the brain, or in sometimes GI, gastrointestinal disease. And so went down that path, and it just, I'm always second guessing myself and trying to think if if this is a dumb idea or has it got no future or not, but it just always continued to compel me. And I always felt like, oh, there's something here, and there's actually some good arguments, but there's some really hard problems to solve.
Yeah, I think a lot of your applications are also on vascular diseases, right? Could you maybe explain a little bit what the problems there and what happens exactly?
Sure. So we've got, of course, blood vessels. We've got, miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers of blood vessels in our body, and it goes everywhere. And the two leading causes of death in the world are from blockages in our blood vessels. That's a myocardial infarction or heart attacks, and the other is ischemic stroke or blood blockages in the brain. They're blood vessel diseases. And so you've got basically this roadway, right? This path to get to all these locations, but they're hard to get to, and they're very delicate. And if you damage blood vessels, in the brain, it's a very bad outcome. And so we had been developing ways of making microrobots move with magnetic fields, generating these external fields. We'd make the microrobots out of magnetic elements. So the three elements that are magnetic are iron, cobalt, and nickel, and then you different alloys of those. And so if you make put some of those materials on your robot, then it'll respond to magnetic fields, and you can guide it. So we had developed a lot of technology, a lot of insight. I think we developed a lot of math and physics in how to generate these fields, and then the fields get stronger or weaker. We call those field gradients. Those and understood all of a sudden how we could model this and control it just like we do a robot arm. And so
in the beginning, you were mostly applying it to like free-floating robots?
At the beginning, we were applying it to free-floating robots. We were just trying to figure out how to make free-floating robots move under control. And I think in 2009, we finally figured out a good way to do that with 5 degrees of freedom, so that we can move it, translate it in X, Y, and Z, and point it then in two directions. We don't get the long axis of it. We can't really control, but we learned how to do that. And that was important. I think that was kind of a breakthrough in the field. It showed we can control these things very precisely. But then if you think about translating, you think, oh, am I going to just inject these into the body and let them move around? Probably not. And then you realize, oh, you've got all these vascular surgeons, these interventional radiologists that are putting wires and catheters into blood vessels. So probably you're going to use that as a release mechanism. And then so we started looking at that and realized, oh, if we just put magnets on the tip of these guide wires, these catheters and things, then we can use the same math and physics we were using for guiding the robots. And so that then has driven us down the path of treating vascular disease with that.
Could you just briefly summarize how you actually come from the point where there's actually a blockage in the vascular system? What is the doctor actually doing to actually create, and how is the robot actually controlled during this time?
Yeah. So the first thing is to recognize that you've got a blockage. And if you have a stroke, there's an acronym FAST. The F stands for face. A stands for, so if your face gets numb or droops, A stands for arm. S is speech. If your speech gets kind of slurred, if your arm hurts, then the T, the last letter, stands for time. That means you need to get to a hospital as quickly as possible. They bring you in a hospital and they'll do a CT scan, usually an X-ray. They could do an MR, but usually do a CT scan and try and figure out if you've got a blockage somewhere. And if they determine that you do have a blockage, then they want to send you to an interventionalist or an interventional radiologist.
And so how do you actually see the blockage?
So they see it with X-rays. So they look through your body with X-rays. They scored a contrast agent. They scored something that's got a high atomic number that bounces the X-rays bounce off of. And so you can see, it looks like a kind of a roadway. In fact, they call it making a road map, like literally.
So it's basically injected into the bloodstream.
So
then you basically see that at some point the bloodstream is not advancing anymore, and then you can
you'll see that you'll see a blockage. You'll see that the blood is not flowing, that the contrast agent, those particles they put into your blood, those micro nanoparticles are not moving further, and so then they can identify that. And so then they figured, okay, here's where the blockage is. And if you're lucky, you're at a hospital with a stroke center where they can wheel you then into a room, and a radiologist will insert a wire, usually into your femoral artery down in near your groin, and try to string it all the way up into your brain. And once they get to where that clot is, then they'll put another catheter. So this wire is very small, less than a millimeter in size. Then they'll put a catheter over that. Catheter has is hollow inside, a lumen we call it, and then there's a way that catheter can then suck out that blood clot, there's other ways they can get it too, and that's called a mechanical thrombectomy. So that is important to do quickly, and there's a lot of data that shows speed is of the essence. So one study showed that if when you first see those symptoms from fast, if you can get treated within 150 minutes of the onset of those symptoms, you have a 90% chance of leaving the hospital being functionally independent. The more time that this goes untreated, the more brain cells that are dying, and you're losing brain tissue, and eventually you will die, the patient will die. So time is of the essence. And so
how do you actually realize that you have a stroke? So what is like the typical symptom?
Yeah, so face, arm, and speech are the first things. Is your face numb or droopy? Is your arm sore, hurting? Is your speech slurred? And if you see those, if you notice those symptoms, then you think, okay, this is serious. I better get to a clinic that can diagnose me and figure out if I have this, or it could be something else. But
and is there always like a moment where you realize that you have a stroke, or is it also sometimes something which like come up very slowly and then you
they can go slowly. Also with heart attacks, often this is a calcification. It can occur over time, and you just you hear people talking about feeling like there's an elephant on their chest, and these feelings, and a lot of people ignore them or don't think they're serious. But if you feel those symptoms, you realize time is of the essence. It doesn't make sense to wait. And you go to a emergency room, they'll ask you some questions. They'll realize right away whether they need to go further or whether they can find it something else. And then if they diagnose that, then it's important that you get to an interventionalist, a doctor that can go in and treat this. So if you're lucky, you went to a hospital where there's one there. If you're not as lucky, then you're either going to have to go by ambulance or helicopter to the nearest center where they do support that. And that takes time. So, of
course. And could you maybe also talk very briefly about how those blockages actually form?
Well, there's different ways they can form. Some is just, atherosclerosis. You get deposits, and then some of those deposits will break loose. People who suffer from heart arrhythmias, particularly atrial fibrillation, are more prone. So, and if you do have some of these heart arrhythmias, sometimes they will give you blood thinners to make your blood purposely less viscous so that it flows better. Problem with that is you get cut, then you bleed more, but that's better than having these. But yeah, these are things that can build up over time, and then something will come loose, and it'll create this blood clot. Yeah.
And did you maybe along this journey learn anything about how you could prevent those blood clots from?
Well, I mean, yeah, you always hear things, right? Don't smoke. Smoking's not good. Doesn't help. Eat healthy. That's why we talk about cholesterol and fats and trying to reduce those, eating properly, diet, exercise is good. So a lot of the things you hear are really focused on trying to prevent these kinds of blockages from occurring.
And are you following all those advice?
Let's see. Well, I don't smoke. I could probably eat more healthy, but I do get checked from my doctor on my cholesterol levels and whether one of the things treatments, if you do have high cholesterol and you can't treat it with diet, is they give you statins. and those have proven to be very effective. They have side effects, but they're also, I think, the clinical evidence that some of these drugs are effective is indisputable. So yeah, I certainly think of that, and I work with a lot of the surgeons who know all this stuff, so they're always, and I actually sometimes get to go watch procedures and get a understanding of what's going on and what it looks like to get one of these, at least what it looks like in X-rays.
We also started a lot of different companies, and I would say also very successful companies. Maybe you could share a little bit about which companies you're currently involved in. And
yeah, so when I first started working in Microrobotics, I think in 1998, we started thinking about how to manipulate biological cells. And one of the first things I wanted to do was figure out how much force was I exerting on the individual cells when I was trying to grasp them and manipulate them. And so I tried to buy something. I went online, actually 98, I'm not sure if we had catalogs or what's online, but anyway, I couldn't find anything and realized that there was really a gap in the market. There wasn't something to make force measurements at those scales. And so we were learning MEMS technology, microelectromechanical systems, and some of this. And so we spent 4 years learning how to make force sensors at these proper scales. And so that then turned into a spin-off company we spun out in 2007 called Femtotools. And so what we had been able to develop was a force sensor, which compared to all over the years, then other things came to market, but we've always found our force sensor was cheaper. It was more precise and faster than anything on the market. We were able to beat the competition in there. And so eventually found a good market for that. And then that company was just acquired a few months ago by Oxford Instruments, a much bigger company now that's in scientific instrumentation. And so they'll be able to expand the market for that device. So that's been successful. We also funded a company in 2010 called Aeon Scientific, and that company was able to treat patients suffering from heart arrhythmias and that. And then more recently, Nanoflex Robotics is a company that spun off in 2021, November 2021. And it is trying to address this ischemic stroke, this blood clot in the brain issue with our magnetic fields, and being able to do that in a remote procedure. In other words, the doctor doesn't need to be near the patient. He or she can do it from pretty much anywhere in the world, as long as they're at the right hospitals.
So let me just quickly talk about magnetic fields. So are there any disadvantages to using magnetic fields? Is it inferring somehow with the human body? Are there any problems?
Yeah. So we are very comfortable with putting human bodies in magnetic fields. That's what magnetic resonance imaging is all about. We know what's safe and we know what's not. What's not safe is when they oscillate very quickly. So they're rapidly moving. But the magnetic fields we use are slow, and they're much weaker than MR fields. So they are probably 50 to 100 times weaker than an MR field. So we know that the fields are safe. We're not worried about any problem. We have to worry about interference with other equipment in the room, but those are engineering problems that we solve. But the problem with the magnetic fields is they drop off with the cube of the distance. So if I go from 1 centimeter away from my electromagnet to 10 centimeters away, the field has actually gotten 1,000 times weaker. And so that's the challenge, is dealing with weak fields and developing devices that can respond to those. So that's really the disadvantage of magnetics more than anything, is that you need to figure out how to generate these. It takes some power, takes some energy to generate high enough fields, but we can generate these throughout the human body in ways that we think are effective.
So what would happen if I actually have a magnetic field which is switching very quickly? What would be the consequence for the tumor?
Well, so you can start heating tissue, and basically it can become almost like microwaving, cooking things. So, but we know what the limits are for that, and we're not even close. And with MR, you hear about people who, have tattoos and have, problems with some of the particles in their heating, but we're far from those kinds of dangers with our system. So.
Okay, let me get back a little bit to startups again. So how difficult was it actually to make the switch from academic research to industrial applications, to developing a product, and what were maybe some lessons which you learned along the way?
Well, it's a different kind of challenge for sure. It's one thing to do research and publish articles and give talks on it. It's a completely different thing to produce a product that people want to pay money for. It's difficult to understand markets. If you're in the medical space, to understand regulatory agencies. And I guess that's one of the things that is interesting to me, is trying to understand that. But it's also, it can be extremely stressful because you've got a company going, you've got to have budgets. And if you can't keep the money coming in, you've got to lay off people. Eventually your company goes under, and that's a stress level you don't have when you're just doing research, right? I think the lessons learned are, the most important thing with a company is the team. You've got to have a good group of people that work well together, that can handle the stress and the uncertainty of a company. The second thing is the technology. And of course, that's what I'm interested in, is trying to move my technology out of the lab and trying to understand what's the advantage of this technology over the state of the art that's out there. And then the third is the business plan. And is there a way to make money off of what you're thinking of? Are you going to be able to get a return on the investment? And I think, so team is key. Technology, for my preferences as an engineer, that's absolutely important as well. The business plan, I figure if we're in a good area, there's good business people out there, and we'll figure out ways to make money. And that's one thing I can say, working with companies that I've developed a lot of respect for, are good business people that really have a good business sense, and good salespeople, people that are really able to market their ideas effectively. And that's a skill set as an engineer I never appreciated as much until I started looking at getting these things, trying to move technology out of the lab and into commercial viability.
So when you say want a good team, so what would you say are the most important attributes of someone who you would try to hire, for example?
Well, I think a good, first of all, the team has to be passionate about what they're doing. There are going to be hard times.
So passion is basically...
Passion is very important. They've also got to be good team players. They got to get along with each other. You want people that, stand up for themselves, but also can interact and give ground as well, and deal with others in effective ways. I think that's important. You want people that deal with uncertainty. You go in, you think you know what the business is, you think what the business case is, and then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, we were wrong. We didn't see this part of it. We didn't understand this part of the business, and people that can recognize that and know, when do you stick with your original idea, and when do you decide, wait a minute, we've got to shift gears. And that decision can be very, very difficult to make. You don't want to give up too soon, but you also don't want to wait too long either. Those are hard questions that need to be answered and answered effectively.
Besides being a very successful founder of startups, you're also leading a very successful research group, right? So I just wanted to quickly ask you about what makes, for example, someone an A player in your research group. What are the attributes which someone needs to have for conducting really successful research in microrobotics?
Well, similar to, the team for a company, you want people that are excited, that, you can see the spark in their eyes when you're talking about ideas. They're interested. They have an open mind. They're trying to make connections that a lot of other people don't even think about. So you want that. You want teamwork is key. We're a robotics group fundamentally, which means we build systems, which means it's not like sitting around thinking deep thoughts and all of a sudden, you've solved this one problem. It's a lot of things have to come together. And I think that getting people that can work together effectively is important. Hard work is key. Everybody's out there, if you want to be the top in your field, you gotta work as hard or harder than everybody else. And there are a lot of groups out there that are really spend a lot of time and a lot of late nights, a lot of weekends, a lot of holidays trying to hit that deadline. And so I think that's also key to it.
And so how do you personally actually balance all those things which you have to do daily? So for example, writing grants, reading research papers, actually doing research, supervising students. How do you actually structure a typical day? How does a typical day?
I don't know if I have a typical day. Let's see. But well, first you need a good support team. I have excellent administrative staff that have been with me for more than 20 years, some of them. And so you can trust them, right? So I don't have to pay attention necessarily to some of those details, like, things like budgets or hiring and all the, a lot of these things that are really important to do well. You got to have people that you can trust and they can take care of that for you. And then it's a hierarchy in a way that, I have a co-director who's a chemist. I'm a mechanical engineer. So Salvador Pani, he takes the materials and fabrication side of things. I take more of the system side. And then we have scientists and postdocs who, take responsibilities, and then the PhD students. And then we've got our master's thesis and our bachelor's thesis, and it's a hierarchy. And, it's important that we all are on the same page. I appreciate the importance of having a good, clear vision statement for your group, a good, clear mission statement. This is what we're about and what we do. And then we just need to communicate and get together periodically and make sure we're all on the same page and know what's going on.
So one question which I was really burning to ask you is basically about the future of microrobotics, nanorobotics. So what is basically the smallest scale where we could go to? What would you say? Do you think it would be actually possible to have like atomic scale robots manipulating something?
So, we were in nanorobotics. I mean, we are in nanorobotics and we talk about it, but if you look at microorganisms, there aren't many interesting microorganisms that are smaller than a micron in size. So that's a millionth of a meter. That's about 1/100th the size of a grain of a strand of hair. So, why is that? Why are bacteria not much smaller than that? Bacteria that propel themselves, flagellated bacteria like E. coli. And it comes back to this phenomena called Brownian motion, which is where when you get below a micron in size, all of a sudden these things get knocked around by the atoms individually. And a guy by the name of Robert Brown, a Scotsman back in, I think, the 1700s, 1800s, was looking at pollen grains under a microscope, and he noticed them dancing around, and he thought, I found the life force. This is a magical force. Look, these things have. But so then he was a good scientist. So then he took some granite particles and he put them under the microscope, and he saw the same thing. And he's like, okay, I guess I didn't find the life force. But he's noticed this phenomena and didn't really understand it. And it wasn't until Albert Einstein, in one of his 1905 papers, his famous year, where he explained that connection and explained statistically how atoms can actually make, these particles are much, much larger than an atom, but they can actually be knocked around by that. And that's where I think from a microrobotic standpoint, for me, it gets less interesting because things just are getting knocked around by atoms. There's still a lot of interesting work, of course, going on in nanoparticles. We do a lot of work with nanoparticles and things, but in terms of making things move, it's really a micron is kind of the limit. And then below that, it's adding material properties to our devices.
You basically say that 1 micron is the limit.
So 1 micron is about where we look, and most of the devices we're making now are in the hundreds of microns to a millimeter. I think right now we're we're working with some devices that are about 800 microns, about an eighth of a millimeter in size, and we can move those within the brain, within the body, at human scales. And as we get smaller and smaller, it gets harder and harder. We'll get better at it. It's just a lot of parameters, a lot of things have to come together and all this to get this stuff to work well. So.
Yeah, you control robots mostly by using magnetic fields, right? Do you think there are also alternative ways of how you can manipulate?
Yeah. So people have looked at using light. Problem, light doesn't penetrate the body if you want to do it in the body very well. People have also looked at using chemistries, catalytic motors and things like that, but a lot of the chemistries are toxic, so those aren't very good. But one area that's interesting is using ultrasound. So we ultrasound's used to look in the body a lot, but we can also use that ultrasonic energy and harvest it in a device and cause it to move. And I think there's some interesting work there. We've done a little in it, but other people are doing much, much more. I think there's a lot of possibilities there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think there are also a lot of different applications outside of the medical fields? So do you think we might see some applications, for example, in climate change or agricultural sciences?
Yeah, we kind of stumbled across materials that can actually degrade micropollutants. So we were coating our microrobots with magnetoelectric material. We say, thinking we could use it to help diffuse the drugs when we wanted, but what we found it was doing was destroying the drugs. And then the light bulb went off in the head of some of my chemists, and they said, "Oh, you know what? There's this problem with micropollutants in the environment. Things like pesticides, some of these drugs coming out of hospitals get into the water chain from also chemical industry, and they're very difficult to remove and expensive and not very environmentally friendly actually to remove." And so some of my group spun off a company called Oxyle, and so they're trying to then commercialize this technology for removing these micropollutants, including these forever chemicals, these PFAS, these that are out there that's become such a big topic now. And so they can actually degrade these chemicals. And so they've got a growing company and are making headway in trying to use some of this technology. So I think environmental remediation, water cleanup, soil cleanup, those are certainly possibilities that we can consider this technology. Anything where you want, large groups of small things to move around and deal with a large scale problem. I think we can find perhaps some technologies coming out of this that are going to be interesting in the future.
Yes. Let me ask you a small fun question.
Okay.
So maybe you have seen this movie Transcendence. It's basically a movie about an AI which is taking over the world, and at some point it does a lot of researching on robots, and then suddenly it can transform every element on the planet, and it do a lot of it can restore, for example, a human body, or it can rearrange things for agricultural sciences. So do you think something like that could be possible in the future using nanorobots, or is it far away?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about it. This is a movie. Let's see, who is the actor in there? Johnny Depp. That's right. I watched part of that movie, and then I was like, okay, this is a little too crazy for me. I was like, okay, I can see where this is going. There's a book by Michael Crichton called Prey that's kind of in the same vein, and I think it's fun to think about that. I mean, we're inspired a lot by science fiction. We talk about Fantastic Voyage, the movie that came out in 1966 on the little submarine that's swimming through a scientist's body trying to cure him of some disease. Science fiction is great. It gives us a lot of motivation. I guess as an engineer, I'm trying to figure out, okay, the vision's great, but how do I actually get there, right? And what makes sense? And sometimes the reality is actually far more interesting than the stories that science fiction people create. Most of the time you find, oh, wow, this is really hard. I don't think we can solve this problem, but who knows, we always learn more. There's always more to learn. So, but it's a long way away if it is coming. So.
Yeah. But at least one thing which seems to be possible is to like transport drugs to the human body using robots. So I just wanted to like ask you, how far are we there? What kind of drugs can we transport? What kind of diseases can we cure?
Yeah. Well, so the groups I know and the companies I know are looking at primarily two diseases. One are brain cancer, things like gliomas, glioblastomas, these very, very aggressive brain cancers. There's not a lot you can do for them. And so I think one of the reasons to look at these is you can get regulatory approval more quickly because there's such a need. And there is a case to be made for how you might be able to treat some of these kind of spider tumors that are infiltrating the brain. So that makes sense. The other thing I think are these vascular diseases we talked about, the blood clots in the heart and in the brain. Right now we have, standard of care is putting a wire in and trying to use it with a catheter to bring it out. And I think that can be very effective, but I think we can do better, but it's going to take a long time if we have to do it safely. You don't want to take a step back, and that makes it a hard problem to solve. It's not like a self-driving car that can crash once in a while. You want it to, you don't want to give a patient a lower standard of care than what's currently available. And that makes it hard. But I think there are things we can do. I think we can go deeper into the brain where we can't reach some of these wires. I think we can treat some of these diseases in ways we haven't thought of before. But it's not easy. That's why we do it, right? It's a challenge, and it's fun when you start solving pieces of the puzzle.
And if you say we should go deeper into the brain, does it mean that we are also doing some manipulation in the brain, or is it more just about delivering drugs really to a targeted area?
Yeah, it's more about delivering drugs to targeted areas. So we can only reach certain, I talked about these mechanical thrombectomies and the guide wires. They can only go a certain level into the brain before they're just too big. And if we can make smaller devices, we can actually start breaking up maybe further deeper into the brain. If you talk to neurosurgeons and some of the doctors who deal with these people, yeah, we take the blood clot out, but they're still not the same, right? They still can have some side effects from that. And some of them believe that there's blockages deeper in the brain that we're just not able to get to. So maybe there's something we can do there. People talk about things like Alzheimer's, right? And these plaques in the brain. And are there ways we can help break those up with some of these? I mean, these are all far out ideas, but they're not unrealistic ideas, and they're certainly worth investigation. So I think, but no, we're not looking at manipulating people's brains in some nefarious way, right? So
that sounds good. Yeah, and if you look actually back over your whole career, what would you say is like the one thing which you're most proud of?
Oh, that's easy. The students that come out of my lab. Yeah. Great people come through. You work with good people, and you watch them go out and create these great labs. It's very gratifying. So, yeah.
And what would you say to someone who wants to actually go into the whole field of microrobotics? What kind of things should someone like that study? What kind of topics should they?
Well, it's a very broad field. So we, my group's lucky that, I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm a robotic systems kind of guy. I can integrate X-ray systems with magnetic navigation systems, with controllers for doctors. But then I get to work very closely with a chemist and his team, and they bring in that side of it. And so I always think of students, it's not always the case, but I think of students either more gravitating to physics or chemistry, right? And I've always gravitated more to physics, and my co-director, Salvador, he gravitates more to the chemistry side of things. They're both super important. And I think, that the most important thing is find what you're doing interesting and fascinating, so you look forward to doing it. And then you got to work as a part of a team, and bring all these different pieces of the puzzle together. And it's not just the chemists and the physics side. You guys also work with the medical doctors and convince them that what you're doing is interesting, and then also learn from them and try to understand more deeply what it is they're really doing, and is there some way I can help. And then if you really want to get this out of the lab, you gotta think about the business side and what investments it's going to take to bring this to fruition, and how can you make a case to the investors that this is worth taking a risk on. And so it's a very multidisciplinary problem, very interdisciplinary problem.
And so if you work in such a high discipline, interdisciplinary topic, so how difficult is it actually to get so many teams and so many people from different industries, from different subjects, expertise together? And how do you actually put them all onto one problem? How do you such a large heterogeneous group together?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to the people. And so you want people that are deep in areas, but then have broad interests and are willing to work on other problems. So you need, good chemists, good materials people. You need good programmers, right? You need good systems level people. You want to meet those doctors that can see the future and see where this is going to go in 20 years. And it's just networking, right? It's just talking to people, giving talks, and it's just part of, what interests you, what excites you. And I've always, liked to move from, problem to problem and try to understand how things work. And I think, then you find like-minded people and somebody can solve this problem, somebody else solves this problem. And all of a sudden you've got, 1 + 1 is 3, right? So it's cool.
And recently we had such a big, revolution with ChatGPT and all the large language models. Do you think there would actually be some benefit to your fields coming from models like that?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. We do look at transformers. We have done learning. I'm having a hard time seeing in a lot of our work how we can apply some of these large language models, but we are looking at it. We're considering and trying to figure it out. My big hope for ChatGPT has always been, I work with people. I'm lucky. English is my first language, and I'm lucky that English is a language of science. Communication in English for me comes relatively easy. I've got these brilliant people, English can be their second, third, fourth language. And anything that helps them communicate their ideas more effectively without having to worry about, did I, use the wrong verb here with this noun or something, anything that can help them write better and communicate better is good. I don't believe ChatGPT is going to solve our research problems for us, at least in its current forms and in the near future. But if it can help us write more clear text, it can help us organize our communication better. I think that's the big win, because I always tell my students, you can do the best science in the world, but if you can't communicate it, it's all for naught. And I think that's my hope for ChatGPT, is we will help us communicate better, and we can focus on the ideas more and less on crafting that perfect paragraph or sentence, right? Which I appreciate. I love great writing, but I think, we also want to focus on our ideas, right?
And is there some project which you've just maybe started to work on, which you're super excited about?
Well, the most exciting research I've done is always the research I'm working on. So we're getting now to the point where we've got robotic capsules. These are capsules that we can move, that we can see, that can perform a task. And we're able to move these now at human scales in the body. And after you see it, you'll think, oh, of course, but you don't realize how many years and how many wrong paths it took to get there. And so I'm looking forward to upcoming trials that are going to demonstrate that. And I look forward to getting that paper out. And And then the other thing that we've learned a lot over the last several years is how to generate these magnetic fields in the body. And I think there's a lot more we can do with them. We just did an animal trial where we guided an endoscope in a pig, controlling it from Zurich in Hong Kong, so 9,300 kilometers away. First time anybody had done it that way in a pig. And I think that's going to open up possibilities. And then what I'm really looking for, and I spend a lot of time going to got a lot of connections down in Africa, to Ghana, to Botswana, to South Africa. We're looking at how we can use some of this technology in remote clinics. I was just in a clinic a while ago in South Africa, where if you show up there with a stroke, you've got a 5 to 8 hour truck ride to the nearest center to get treated. Well, by that time, you're not in good shape. But they really have the infrastructure that if we put a system in there, we could have a surgeon from Zurich, Switzerland, for instance, connecting down there and helping guide a procedure. And so that, to me, is exciting as well. So I'll be next week flying down to Johannesburg and then driving up and visiting some of my colleagues there and looking at ways we can start some of these remote surgical experiments and show how this technology that we're developing for microrobotics, though, can translate to curing some of the most devastating diseases that we have.
Yeah, speaking of Africa, you also were in the Peace Corps.
Right.
For some time.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe just quickly talk a little bit about your time?
Well, sure. Yeah. So, the United States Peace Corps is an organization started in 1961 when John F. Kennedy was president. And the idea was to send Americans to these, around remote places in the world. And you had 3 goals as a Peace Corps volunteer. You still do. One was to bring some skill to this that's needed in this place. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, my skill was I taught math in a high school. The other thing you're supposed to do is train a local person to take your job. You're supposed to work yourself out of a job. So that's your second goal. Then your third goal is to come back to the United States, my home at the time, and educate the other Americans about this great country. So I was in Botswana. And so actually my wife was also a Peace Corps volunteer. We met each other in Africa. And so we've enjoyed doing over the last more than 30 years now, is telling people what a great place this is, how great the people are. Right? And so the Peace Corps is, some people forget, for some reason, Chinese people think it's a military thing, but it's not. It's a purely civilian thing, and it's a great thing to do when you have, particularly when you're young, when you don't have a lot of responsibilities, and you're willing to live at very low levels. I think I made about $200 a month, just enough to live on in this village.
How long, right?
I was there about 2.5 years. My wife was there for, I think, just over 3 years.
And you taught math?
I taught math in a junior high and high school math, which I learned how hard teaching is. Man, I have a lot of respect for real teachers. As a professor, I get up and I give lectures, a few hours a week or so, but doing it all day long that's a hard job. And it was certainly a life-changing experience for me.
And so in 2002, you actually moved from the US, I think, to Switzerland.
Right.
So why did you actually make this move, and what do you love about Switzerland?
Yeah, well, I think we were at Minnesota at the time. We'd been there, and my wife and I were just, we had just been talking. Our kids were small. We had, they were 4, 7, and 9, I think. We were like, Minnesota's nice. We like people here, but maybe there's another career step. Maybe we can think about moving again somewhere else. And I happened to get an email. I knew there was a position open at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH Zürich, but I never thought of dreaming of applying for it. I got an email, and so just about the time we were having this discussion, so I said to my wife, "Oh, it doesn't hurt to send a CV." And I went. It was a beautiful day in June. The mountains were out. Zurich's a beautiful city, especially when the weather's nice. And I said to my wife, Dana, you need to come out here. So we came and said, oh, let's see how this goes for 5 years. And life's been interesting. So we've raised our kids there. Daughters are there. I've got a grandson now there. So we've been there, almost 22 years now. So, but, Switzerland is a lot of similarities between Switzerland and the United States. I think a very innovative country, but it's a much smaller country. So that changes, and there's of course a lot of differences too, but it's a nice place to live and a beautiful country.
Is this something which you're missing about the US?
Mostly it's away from family. Parents are older. My wife's family's in the West Coast. My folks are in the Midwest. And I look for chances to get back to the US just to stop by, see how they're doing. And we've got family there. And I think that's what we miss more than anything is just families.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing the podcast. Maybe you have like some last words to the robotics community, something which maybe people could do better in the community.
Well, I think robotics is a wonderful thing to study. I think it combines two things that I love. It combines technology. I like building stuff. I like making stuff. But you also have to be a bit of a philosopher. You have to think of the nature of intelligence. You have to think of the nature of the world. How do you model the world? And these can be deeply philosophical questions. So I think that's what you see, at these meetings. You see people developing really cool technologies, and then you people talking about representations and how do we represent this, and what's the nature of that? And I think these are great questions that you go back to philosophers from centuries ago who asked the same very, very similar questions. And that's one of the reasons I love the field. And I was lucky to fall into it by accident, more or less.
Well, that sounds very good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andreas. It's a pleasure.